She pressed her last $15 bill flat against the courthouse clerk's desk with both hands, smoothing it like it was made of something holy. The man behind the counter looked at her, really looked at her, the way people had been looking at her whole life. Like she was a problem someone else had forgotten to clean up. She was 18 years old. She had slept behind a diner the night before. She owned nothing except a backpack with a broken zipper and a body the whole town had already decided was something to laugh at. And she was buying a haunted mansion. Gerald Pitts had worked behind that counter for 22 years, without once being surprised by anything. He had processed deeds for farms, for storefronts, for parcels of land nobody wanted, and a few pieces of property people had fought over like dogs over a bone. He had seen nervous buyers, and greedy buyers, and buyers who didn't know what they were doing, and buyers who knew exactly what they were doing, and were doing it anyway, because pride wouldn't let them stop. But in 22 years, Gerald Pitts had never once seen a buyer like the one standing in front of him on that cold October morning. She was large. That was the first thing people always noticed, because people always noticed that first, before they noticed anything else. Before they noticed the intelligence in her dark eyes, or the steadiness in the way she held herself, or the fact that her chin didn't drop even a fraction of an inch under his stare. She was heavy-set and tall, dressed in clothes that had been washed too many times and worn too many days in a row. Her dark hair was pulled back, the way women pull their hair back when they don't have time for anything except surviving. She looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had made peace with the weight of it. She placed the deed advertisement on the counter beside the $15. It was a clipping from the 40 Blackwood Hollow Gazette, 4 weeks old, the edges soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. Gerald asked her if she understood what she was purchasing, and it was not quite a question. It was the kind of statement a man makes when he wants to give someone an exit without making them feel like they're being offered one. Ara told him it was Blackthorne Manor. All structures on the property, the well, the outbuildings, and the 37 acres attached to the original deed. She looked at him directly when she said it, and added that she had read the listing more than once. When he told her the property was in significant disrepair, that there had long been concerns about the foundation, she said she knew that too. Gerald set his jaw in that particular way men set their jaws when they have decided that a problem is not their problem and have given sufficient warning. He took the money. He processed the deed. He stamped it in 3 places and slid it across the counter with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned not to attach himself to outcomes. "Property is yours," he said. She picked up the deed with both hands and held it for a moment before she folded it carefully and put it inside her jacket against her chest, close to her heart. The way people carry things, they are afraid of losing. She thanked him, and then she walked out. Gerald Pitts watched her walk out the door. Then he picked up the telephone on his desk and called the first person he could think of, because in Blackwood Hollow, Kentucky, that was what you did when something happened that you needed to talk about. By noon, everybody knew her name was Ara Whitmore, and she was 18 years old, and she had just bought Blackthorne Manor for $15. If you had walked through the center of town that afternoon and listened to the conversations happening on porches and in the diner and behind the counter at the hardware store, you would have thought you were listening to a town that had been handed the funniest joke it had heard in years. "The homeless girl," they said. "Did you hear the one who sleeps behind the halfway house diner? Big girl, dark hair, always walking around with that backpack like she's going somewhere. She bought the Blackthorne place. $15. Can you imagine? Poor thing doesn't know what she walked into. Poor thing is going to be back sleeping behind the diner before the first frost. You mark my words." There was laughter in most of those conversations. Not cruel laughter, exactly. Most of the people of Blackwood Hollow were not at their core cruel people. It was the kind of laughter that comes from discomfort dressed up as amusement, from people who saw something that made them uneasy and chose to make a joke of it rather than sit with the discomfort. It was easier to laugh at the homeless girl buying the haunted house than it was to ask why an 18-year old girl was homeless in the first place? Nobody in Blackwood Hollow asked that question. Almost nobody. One person who did not laugh was Rosalie Briggs, who owned the flower shop on Main Street and who had on 3 separate occasions over the past 2 months left a brown paper bag of food on top of the dumpster behind the diner at 7 in the morning, precisely timed so that whoever was sleeping back there could find it without anyone watching. When she heard the news, she went quiet for a long moment before she said, very softly, "Well, good for her." She did not explain. The other person who did not laugh was Calvin Harrington. Calvin Harrington was 63 years old and had been the wealthiest man in Blackwood Hollow for so long that most people couldn't remember a time when he wasn't. He was thin and silver-haired and wore his money the way some men wear a coat, like it was just something he had put on and forgotten to take off. He owned the land on 3 sides of Blackthorne Manor. He had owned it for 30 years, waiting with the particular patience of a man who knows that eventually everything comes to him, and he had been confident, deeply and comfortably confident, that the Blackthorne property would be no different. It would sit there until the county finally moved to condemn it, and then he would step in, as he always stepped in, and he would acquire it for nothing and add it to everything else he already had. When word reached his office within the hour, Calvin Harrington did not laugh. He set down the glass he was holding very carefully on his desk and said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Then he asked who it was. Again, Ara Whitmore, his assistant, told him. 18 years old, homeless, as far as anyone knows. Been in town about 3 months. She bought it. $15. Legal deed, signed and stamped. Calvin picked his glass back up. Find out everything you can about her, he said, and find out exactly what she knows. When his assistant left the room, Calvin sat alone and looked out his window toward the hill at the edge of town, where Blackthorne Manor sat behind its curtain of vines and broken fences. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite worry and not quite anger, but was some cold combination of the two, because Calvin Harrington knew things about Blackthorne Manor that the rest of Blackwood Hollow did not know, and the last thing in the world he had ever expected was for anyone to actually go inside. Ara did not know about any of that. She did not know that by the time she was walking up the long overgrown path toward the manor, with her backpack over one shoulder and the deed pressed against her chest, a man in an expensive suit was already thinking about how to take back the thing she had just bought. She knew only what she could see in front of her, which was a house that looked like it had spent a very long time waiting for someone to notice that it was still standing. The first time she walked through the front door, the sound it made was enormous, a groan that started deep in the hinges and moved through the whole frame, like a body waking up from a long sleep. Ara stood in the doorway for a moment and let the sound finish before she stepped inside. The air was cold and still and smelled of old wood and dust, and something beneath that. Something she couldn't name right away, that she would later think of as the smell of things that had been kept too long in the dark. She stood in the entryway and looked. The staircase ahead of her had held. The banister was cracked in 2 places, but the stairs themselves were solid oak that had survived decades, better than the rest of the house. The floors were covered in a thick layer of dust that showed in the slant of gray light from the broken windows. No footprints, except hers moving forward. The wallpaper had peeled away in long strips from the upper walls, curling at the edges like old letters. The chandeliers in the main hall were still there, iron and tarnished, holding their shapes like they refused to give up. Ara walked through every room on the ground floor slowly, the way you walk through a place you are trying to understand. She touched walls. She tested floorboards with her weight. Before she put her full foot down, she opened doors and closed them and noted which ones stuck and which ones swung free and which ones had swollen in their frames. She was not an architect. She had never restored a building. She had no tools and no money and no experience. What she had was a practical intelligence that had been forged in the particular fire of having to figure things out alone since she was very young, and that intelligence was telling her room by room that this house was not lost. It was waiting. It was in the kitchen that she found the dog. He was tucked into the far corner, behind the remains of what had once been a cast iron stove, a golden retriever, so old and thin that his ribs showed through his coat like the fingers of a hand pressed from the inside. He lifted his head when she came in and watched her with eyes that were clouded at the edges, but still remarkably clear at the center. And he did not move, not toward her and not away from her, just watched, with the careful stillness of an animal that has learned not to expect anything and has made peace with that. She set her backpack down slowly so the sound wouldn't startle him. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, which she was fairly certain had not seen a human being sit on it in many years, and she looked at the dog, and the dog looked at her. "Well," she said quietly, "you're still here." The dog's tail moved once. Just once. "Me too," she said. "I guess that means we're in this together." She reached into her backpack and found the last half of a sandwich she had been saving, turkey and bread given to her 2 days ago by one of Rosalie Briggs's brown paper bags. She tore the sandwich in half and put the larger half on the floor between them slowly, and then sat back. The dog waited for a long time. Then he got up very carefully, testing each leg before he trusted it, and walked to the food and ate it with the particular focused dignity of an animal too hungry to be proud about it. When he was done, he lifted his head and looked at her again. "Copper," she said. It came to her without thinking, the color of his coat in the gray light, the color of something old and warm and useful. "I'm going to call you Copper." Copper walked across the kitchen floor and lay down directly beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. And that was how they spent the first hour in Blackthorne Manor together, the large homeless girl and the old dog, sitting on a dusty kitchen floor, while the wind moved through the broken windows and the house settled around them in sounds like a conversation in a language neither of them spoke, but both of them understood. That night was the hardest night she had spent in a long time, and she had spent some very hard nights. She gathered what she could from the old outbuildings: pieces of broken furniture, scraps of old canvas, a moth-eaten blanket she found in a cedar chest that had somehow kept the worst of the moisture out. And she made something in the kitchen beside the old fireplace that was somewhere between a bed and a nest. She lay there in the dark, listening to the house breathe around her, and tried to sleep. The cold came in through every crack. She could hear things moving in the walls, not supernatural things, just mice and the natural settling of old wood. But in the dark of a house she had known for only a few hours, every sound was enormous. Copper pressed himself against her side, and she was grateful for him in a way that went past words. She thought about her mother. Her mother had been dead for 2 years and 11 months, and she still caught herself thinking about her, at the edges of things, at the moment before sleep, in the first few seconds after waking, in the spaces between one hard thing and the next. Her mother had been a woman who believed with a quiet and ferocious conviction that nothing had ever quite managed to break, that people were worth more than what the world gave them credit for. She would have loved this house. Ara pulled the blanket tighter and closed her eyes. "I'm going to fix it," she said out loud to no one, to Copper, to her mother somewhere in the dark. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to fix it." The next morning, she got up before the sun and started cleaning. She had no cleaning supplies, so she made them from wood ash, which she'd read about in a book she'd found in the public library the year before, and stored in her memory the way she stored everything she might someday need. She found an old broom with most of its bristles still attached, hanging in the back pantry. She found rags in a trunk in the hallway that had been used as packing material around china plates and could be repurposed. She found tools in the outbuilding, old but solid, a hammer and a handsaw, and a collection of nails in different sizes in an old tobacco tin. She started with the kitchen because that was where she and Copper lived, and because it was the most practical room in the house, and because there was something about making a kitchen livable that felt like the most basic act of claiming a place as yours. She swept from the center Out. She scrubbed the floor on her hands and knees. She pried the broken shutter from the single kitchen window and reset the hinges with the tools from the outbuilding, getting it to close properly for the first time in however many years it had been hanging wrong. People drove by on the road below the hill. She could hear them slow down sometimes, the crunch of tires going from a steady pace to something more deliberate. And she could imagine the conversation inside the cars just as clearly as if she were sitting in the passenger seat. Look at that. She's still here. Thought she'd be gone by the first night. Give her a week. On the fourth day, 2 boys from town, 16 or 17, came up the path and stood at the edge of the property and called out things she was not going to repeat to herself, even in memory. They laughed and threw pebbles at the broken upstairs windows. She stood in the doorway and looked at them without moving and without speaking. After a while, the weight of her stillness made them uncomfortable enough that they left. On the 7th day, Gerald Pitts drove up the path in his county vehicle and knocked on the front door. She answered it with a dust rag in her hand and flour on her face. She had found a sack of old flour in the pantry, still good, and had been making flatbread over the fire she'd got going in the kitchen fireplace. Gerald looked at her. He looked past her at the entryway, which was swept clean and had the windows propped properly and smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. His expression did something complicated. He told her it was just a welfare check, that the county was required to follow up on recent property transactions. "I'm fine," she said. "The property appears functional," he said, which was not quite what he had expected to say. He had expected to see the beginning of chaos. Instead, he was looking at the beginning of something else. "I'm working on it," she told him. He nodded slowly and asked if there was anything she needed, any resources, any contacts. She said she was fine again, not unkindly, and thanked him for coming. He drove back down the hill, and she watched his taillights, and then went back inside to her flatbread. It was on the 14th day that Calvin Harrington came. He came in a car she had never seen before, long and dark, the kind of car that announces before it even stops that the person inside it believes their arrival to be an event. He came up the path with 2 other men behind him, neither of whom he introduced, and he stood on the steps of Blackthorne Manor and looked at it the way a man looks at something that has appeared in the wrong place. "Miss Whitmore," he said, as if he were doing her a courtesy by knowing her name. "Mr. Harrington," she said, because she had asked around about who owned the land on 3 sides of the manor, and she had gotten his name within the first week. Something moved in his face. Surprise quickly covered. He had not expected her to know him. He told her she was aware of who he was, and that he had a significant interest in this property and the land surrounding it. "You own land near here," she said. "That's not the same as an interest in this property." His jaw tightened. The 2 men behind him were very still. He told her he wanted to be straightforward, and his voice had shifted into something that was almost pleasant. The particular pleasantness of a man who uses pleasantness the way other men use a fist. He said he was prepared to offer her a fair price for the deed, $250. She'd make nearly 17 times what she paid. She could walk away clean, find somewhere more suitable. Ara looked at him for a long moment. "Suitable," she said. "Somewhere more comfortable. A girl in my circumstances." "I'm comfortable," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he began. "Mr. Harrington," she said, and she stepped forward just slightly, just enough to change the geometry of the conversation. "I bought this property legally. I have the deed. If you have a legal question about ownership, there's a courthouse in town where you can look into it. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd step off my steps." The pleasantness left his face, the way water leaves a pan when you tip it fast and complete. He looked at her for a moment, with something in his eyes that she filed away carefully, the way you file away information you know you are going to need later. Then he turned and walked back to his car, and the 2 men followed him, and the car went back down the hill. Ara stood on the steps and watched it go. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was slow. Inside her chest, however, her heart was going fast, not with fear, but with something she recognized as instinct, the deep animal awareness that she had just stood at the edge of something very large, and that the something very large was not finished with her. She went inside and found Copper in his place beside the fireplace, and sat down next to him and put one hand on his side, and felt his breathing slow and steady under her palm. "He's going to come back," she told Copper. "Whatever he wants here, he's going to come back for it." Copper's ear moved. He did not seem particularly worried about this. His faith in her was simple and complete, the way a dog's faith always is, entirely present, entirely without calculation. "All right," she said. "Then we'd better keep looking." She had been looking already, every evening, after the work of the day was done, going through the rooms with the small oil lamp she'd found and refilled, and learning the geography of the house, the way you learn a person, piece by piece. Starting with the obvious and moving toward the hidden. She had been looking for damage to assess, for structure to understand, for anything that needed immediate attention. But she had also been looking for something she couldn't have put into words yet, some sense of what this house had before the neglect, who had lived here, what they had left behind. On the 19th day, she found the draft. She was working in the library, which was on the west side of the first floor, and which had somehow preserved more of its original function than almost anywhere else in the house. Shelves were still there, empty, the tall oak shelves that ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and the 4th wall held a fireplace that was larger than the one in the kitchen, broad-mouthed and deep, with a carved stone mantelpiece that someone had worked on with real skill. Ara had been cleaning the fireplace, removing the accumulated debris of years, old ash and leaves blown in through the chimney, and a bird's nest wedged into the upper flue, when she felt it, cold air moving, not from the chimney and not from the windows, which were the 2 places cold air was supposed to come from behind the back wall of the fireplace. She stopped what she was doing and put her palm flat against the stone. Cold, definite. The kind of cold that comes not from stone itself, but from a space of open air on the other side. She pressed the back wall in different places, methodically, working from left to right and top to bottom, pressing and listening for the sound of something hollow. Most of the stone was solid, but in the lower left quadrant, where the back wall met the side wall, when she pressed and tapped with her knuckle, the sound was different, not solid. Not quite solid. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. Then she went to get the hammer. It took the better part of an hour to work carefully enough to not destroy what she was afraid of damaging. She chipped at the mortar around several of the stones, rather than hammering directly, working with patience. She hadn't known she had until she needed it, and when the first stone came free, the draft intensified dramatically, cold air pouring through the gap like breath. Behind the fireplace, in the space that should have been solid wall, was a door. Small, low, not meant to be walked through standing up, fitted with iron hinges that had rusted to the color of old blood, and a latch that had seized with decades of disuse. She worked the latch with a hammer, S-claw for 10 minutes before it turned, and when it turned, she pushed, and the door opened with a sound like an objection. The air that came out of the darkness beyond the door smelled of old paper and dust and something else, something she would spend a long time trying to name, and would eventually decide was the smell of preserved things, of things kept carefully and deliberately against the inevitable erosion of time. She held the lamp up. The room on the other side was not large, the size of a generous closet, perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with low ceilings and rough stone walls and a wooden floor that had stayed dry, despite everything, because it was sealed from outside air on all sides. There was a desk. There was a chair. There were bookshelves, built directly into the stone walls on 2 sides, and those shelves held documents, papers, ledgers, journals bound in leather, a collection of material that someone had placed here with great deliberation and sealed in, and on the floor beside the desk there was a wooden chest. Ara stood in the doorway and felt the old familiar feeling of standing at the edge of something, the feeling she'd had in the courthouse when she laid her $15 on the counter, the feeling she'd had when she came through the front door of Blackthorne Manor for the first time, the feeling that the next step forward was going to change what came after it, in ways she couldn't yet see. She stepped through the door. She crossed the small room and sat down at the desk, in the chair that had been waiting empty for decades, and she lifted the cover of the first journal she could reach, and she began to read. The handwriting was precise and strong, the handwriting of someone who believed that what they were writing mattered and wanted it to be legible for whoever came after them. On the inside cover of the journal, in ink that had faded from black to a deep brown, were 3 lines: Dr. Evelyn Carter. The 1st of September, 1923. If you are reading this, you found what they tried to bury. Do not let them take it again. Ara read those words 3 times. She read them while the lamp burned beside her, and Copper sat at the entrance to the hidden room, with his head tilted slightly, watching her with his clear, patient eyes. She read them while the house settled around her, making its old familiar sounds of wood and stone and wind, the sounds of something alive. She pressed her palm flat on the open journal page and made a decision that she couldn't have fully explained if anyone had asked her to, a decision that came from somewhere below reason, from the same place her mother's conviction had come from the place where you know something before you can say why you know it. She was not going to let them take it again, whatever it was, whoever they were. She was going to find out the truth of this house, and the truth of the woman who had hidden these words for someone patient enough to find them, and she was going to protect it. The journals of Dr. Evelyn Carter did not give up their secrets easily, and Ara was grateful for that. She had lived long enough to distrust things that came easy. She read through the night, not all of it. The journals were dense with technical language and careful documentation, and her lamp burned low around midnight, and she had to let it rest before she lit it again. But enough to understand the shape of what she was holding, enough to feel the weight of it settle into her chest, like something that had been waiting to land there. Evelyn Carter had been born in 1889 in a farming county in western Kentucky, the daughter of sharecroppers, which meant she had started her life with the particular disadvantage of being both poor and brilliant in a world that didn't know what to do with either quality. When they appeared together in the same body, she had gotten herself educated through a combination of scholarship money and stubbornness that the journals made no effort to romanticize. She had come to Blackthorne Manor in 1919, when she was 30 years old, as the companion and assistant to the last surviving member of the Blackthorne family, an elderly woman named Agnes, who died 2 years after Evelyn's arrival and left the property to her in a will that nobody in Blackwood Hollow had been pleased to honor. Evelyn had spent the next 4 years at the manor conducting research that began as agricultural science and became, over the course of those years, something considerably more significant. She had developed a method that was how she referred to it throughout the journals. The method, with the careful, almost stubborn understatement of a scientist who knows that what she has discovered is large and is trying not to let the size of it make her careless. It was a system of soil preparation and crop rotation and water management that had been developed specifically for the conditions of rural Kentucky. Rocky, depleted soil, irregular rainfall, the particular challenges of land that had been farmed hard and given nothing back for generations. She had tested it on the acreage of Blackthorne Manor over 3 full growing seasons, documenting everything, and the results were not subtle. Land that had been producing barely enough to sustain a single family was producing enough under Evelyn's method to feed 3 times that number, and she had not kept it to herself. That was the part that stopped Ara's breath when she read it. Evelyn Carter had taken her method to the County Agricultural Board in the summer of 1923. She had presented her documentation, and she had offered it freely, not for money, not for credit. She had sat in front of a room full of men who had never expected to see her there, and she had said clearly and without apology that this information belonged to every family in the county that was struggling to feed itself, and that she was prepared to spend whatever time was necessary to teach it to anyone who wanted to learn. The room had not received her well. A man named Harrington, Calvin Harrington's grandfather, had waited for her outside the building. He had not been unkind in the way the men inside had been unkind. He had been something more calculated than unkind. He had offered her money, significant money, enough to leave Kentucky entirely and start somewhere new, in exchange for the research documentation and her agreement to stop speaking publicly about what she had found. He had framed it as an opportunity. He had spoken about her future with what sounded on the surface like genuine concern, and when she had told him no, his face had changed. She wrote that he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply looked at her, the way a man looks at a door he intends to lock, and she understood that the looking was the threat. 3 weeks after that meeting, the rumors about Blackthorne Manor began. The curse story had not arisen organically from the superstitions of rural Kentucky. It had been manufactured deliberately and systematically by people who understood that the most effective way to keep someone isolated was to make other people afraid of being near them. Harold Harrington had money and connections and decades of social capital in Blackwood Hollow, and he had spent a portion of all three on ensuring that Evelyn Carter became a woman people crossed the street to avoid. It had worked. Her last entry was dated the 14th of November, 1923. It was shorter than the others, just half a page, the handwriting slightly less precise than the earlier entries. The ink pressed harder into the paper, as if she were trying to make the words go deeper than the page. I am sealing this room today. I do not know what will happen to me or to this house, but I know that what I have found here is true, and I know that truth survives longer than the people who are afraid of it. To whoever finds this, the method is documented completely in the red ledger. The evidence of what Harrington did is in the blue correspondence folder. Do not be afraid of what you hold. They spent a great deal of effort making everyone afraid of this house precisely because they knew what was inside it. The greatest thing you can do with this information is exactly what they feared. Share it freely, all of it. That is not idealism. It is the completion of the work. The lamp had gone low again. By the time she finished reading, she sat for a while in the silence of the hidden room, with the closed journal in her hands and copper warm against her leg, and she thought about a woman she had never met who had died. She didn't know how, hiding something, and not knowing if what she hid would ever be found by the right person. Ara did not think of herself as the right person. She thought of herself as the available person, the one who had shown up, the one who happened to have $15 and nothing left to lose, and a particular stubbornness about walking away from things. But maybe, she thought, that was what the right person looked like. It was late the next afternoon when the truck came. She heard it on the road below the hill, and then the sound of it slowing, and then, which was different from all the other slowing she had heard over the past 19 days, the sound of it turning up the path. The truck was old and well maintained, the kind of truck that had been used hard for honest work and cared for accordingly. The woman who got out of it was in her mid-50s, solid and practical looking in work clothes and boots, with a kind of face that had spent a lot of time in weather and had opinions about everything it had seen there. She walked up the path with a basket over one arm and a purposefulness to her stride. That made Ara think she had set something before she arrived and was not in the habit of undeciding things. Ara opened the door before the woman could knock. "You're the girl who bought this place," the woman said. "Yes, ma'am. I am May Collier. I farm the land on the south side of the ridge. I've been farming it for 30 years. She held out the basket. "I brought food because I figured if you were still here after 3 weeks, you were probably running short, and because I have a few things I want to say to you, and it is easier to say them if I've done something useful first." Ara took the basket. It was heavy, bread and apples and a jar of preserves, and what looked like a wrapped portion of smoked meat. She felt her throat tighten in the particular way it tightened when she received kindness she hadn't steeled herself against. She invited May in. May walked through the entryway and looked at what Ara had done to the kitchen. The clean floor, the working fireplace, the organized pantry, and something in her expression changed, shifted from assessment to something more like recognition. "You've been working," May said. "Yes, ma'am. Me and Copper." Copper, from his place by the fire, lifted his head and regarded May with dignified interest. May looked at the dog and then back at her. "What I want to say," she said, is that I knew this house when I was a girl. My grandmother talked about the woman who lived here, Dr. Carter. What Harrington's family did to her was wrong. What they did to this house was wrong. Most people in this town know it, even the ones who don't say so. She met Ara's eyes. I want to know if there is something here, she said, something she left. Because if there is, there are people in this county who've been waiting a long time for that to come to light. The silence in the kitchen lasted about 4 seconds. Ara made a decision. Sit down, she said. I'll make tea, and then I'm going to show you something. She showed May the hidden room. She watched May's face as she stood in the doorway with the lamp, looking at the desk and the shelves and the journals. And she watched the woman's expression do something complicated and private that Ara did not intrude upon. Then May reached out and put her hand on the doorframe and stood there like that for a moment, steadying herself. Lord in heaven, May said very softly. The red ledger is the research documentation, Ara told her. The method she developed. 3 seasons of data. The blue folder is correspondence, evidence of what the Harrington family did to suppress it and discredit her. May turned to look at her. You read all of this, most of it. I've been up all night. May looked at the journals, and then back at her, and then she did something Ara had not expected. She sat down in the chair at the desk and put both hands flat on the surface and bowed her head for just a moment. The way people bow their heads in church, when the weight of something is too large for standing. Then she lifted her head and said they needed a lawyer, a good one. Not one of the ones Harrington kept in his pocket, which was most of them. There was a man named Nathaniel Brooks, she said, who practiced out of Harlan County, who had taken on a land dispute case about 10 years back that nobody thought could be won. He had won it. Can he be trusted? Ara asked. He's the only one I'd trust with this, May said. All right, Ara said. Can you contact him? I can try, May said, but I need you to understand something. If we go forward with this, if we try to bring this to light, Harrington is going to come at you with everything he has. And he has a great deal. He's already been here, Ara said. May's eyes sharpened. What did he say? He offered me $250 for the deed. And you said? I told him to step off my steps. May looked at her for a long moment. Something in the older woman's expression shifted, settled, became something Ara recognized as a decision being made. All right, May said. Then we need to move quickly. They spent the next 4 hours working through the hidden room together. May with her phone, methodically photographing each document and each page, Ara holding the lamp, and organizing the materials in the order May requested. And in between the work, they talked. The way people talk when they are doing something together that matters, with the particular openness that comes from shared purpose. It was mid-afternoon when May's phone buzzed. Calvin Harrington had filed a complaint that morning with the county assessor's office, she said. He was claiming the sale of the property was procedurally irregular and asking for a review. He can't take it back, Ara said. The deed is legal. Gerald Pitts stamped it himself. He doesn't need to take it back in court, May said. He just needs to slow things down long enough to apply enough pressure that you decide it isn't worth fighting. This is how he works. He creates friction. He makes everything harder. He makes you feel like the system is against you at every turn, until you decide the path of least resistance is giving up. I've been on a path of least resistance before, Ara said. It leads behind a diner. May looked at her steadily. No, she said, that is not a path of least resistance. That's something else entirely. She put her phone down on the table. I'm calling Brooks now, she said. The call lasted 40 minutes. When May hung up, she sat for a moment looking at her phone. He's driving up tomorrow, she said. He wants to see the originals. And he said, if the documentation is what I described, and the blue folder contains what I said it contains, then what you have here is not just a property dispute. It's evidence of deliberate fraud, suppression of public information, and potentially criminal defamation. The Harrington family has a significant liability problem. Ara sat with that for a moment. He's been coming at me for 3 weeks, like I'm nothing, she said. It wasn't anger in her voice. It was something quieter and more complicated than anger. The specific bewilderment of someone who has been treated as negligible and is only now understanding that the dismissal was not careless. It was calculated. He's known this whole time what might be in here, she said. Yes, May said. He's known his whole life. His father knew. His grandfather started it. The afternoon was moving toward evening, and the light through the kitchen window was going the color of old brass, warm and slanted. Copper got up from his spot and walked to Ara and put his head on her knee, and she put her hand on his head automatically, the gesture of someone who had gotten used to the comfort of him in 3 weeks. What happens now? She asked. Now, May said, we don't let him make this quiet. That is his strongest play. Keep it contained. Keep it local. Handle it before it becomes something he can't manage. So, we make it something he can't manage. She leaned forward slightly. I have a friend at the regional newspaper, she said. Not local. Regional, out of Lexington. I've been thinking for the last 4 hours about whether to call her. What would you tell her? Ara asked. That a 100-year-old injustice is sitting in a hidden room, in a manor that an 18-year-old woman bought for $15, May said simply, and that the same family that buried it the first time is already trying to do it again. The weight of what May was saying settled over the kitchen. Ara thought about Evelyn Carter, sitting at the desk in the hidden room a century ago, writing words to someone she would never meet, trusting that the truth was worth preserving, even if she wouldn't live to see it freed. She thought about her mother, who had believed people were worth more than the world gave them credit for, and who had died before she got to see whether she was right. Call her, she said. May nodded once and picked up her phone, and that was the moment. Not the purchase, not the finding of the hidden room, not even the reading of Evelyn's final letter. That was the moment. Ara Whitmore felt the thing she had been fighting toward without knowing it, the thing that had been pulling her forward through cold nights and mocking voices, and 100 small, impossible obstacles. Since she delayed her $15 on a courthouse counter, she felt it settle into her spine, like something vertebral, something load-bearing. She felt like she was doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. The regional journalist's name was Sandra Page, and she arrived the next afternoon, 2 hours before Nathaniel Brooks. She was younger than Ara had expected, late 30s maybe, with sharp eyes and the focused energy of someone who had learned to move quickly before subjects changed their minds. She came in, and she shook Ara's hand, and she looked at the house around her with professional assessment, taking in details without commenting on them, and then she said, "Show me what you found." Ara showed her the hidden room. Sandra Page stood in the doorway and looked at the journals and the ledgers and the blue correspondence folder for 30 seconds without speaking. Then she said she needed to make a call and stepped away, and Ara could hear her voice from the hallway, low and urgent, the voice of someone describing something to an editor that the editor is going to want. When she came back, she said she wanted to do this right, which meant she needed time to verify. She needed to photograph the documents, and she needed Ara's full account on the record. Everything Harrington had said and done since she bought the property. Everything. Ara sat down with her at the kitchen table while May watched the door and Copper slept by the fire, and she told Sandra Page everything. She started with the courthouse and the $15 and Gerald Pitts' face. She told her about the first 3 weeks of work alone, about the boys with the pebbles, about Gerald's welfare check and his expression when he saw the clean entryway. She told her about Harrington's first visit and what he'd said and what she'd said back. She told her about the letter and the penciled note at the bottom. Sandra wrote quickly and asked occasional questions, and did not once tell Ara she was surprised by anything, which Ara appreciated. She did not want to be someone's surprise. She wanted to be someone's story. Near the end, Sandra leaned forward slightly and said she wanted to ask something personal that she didn't have to answer. "Go ahead," Ara said. "You, 18 years old," Sandra said. "You had $15 and nowhere to go. Most people in your position, faced with this level of opposition from someone with Harrington's resources, they'd have taken the money and walked away. Why didn't you?" Ara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table. She thought about how to say what she wanted to say in a way that was true without being performed, without reaching for the dramatic answer, when the real one was simpler. Because walking away doesn't actually take you anywhere, she said finally. I'd been walking away from things my whole life, or having things walked away from me, which is the same feeling from the inside. And I got here, and I found a woman who refused to walk away, even when everything was against her, even when she lost. She paused. She didn't actually lose. It turns out, she was just waiting for somebody to come open the door. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote something down and circled it. Nathaniel Brooks arrived at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He was 60 years old and built like a man who had carried a lot of weight for a long time and was used to it, broad through the shoulders and deliberate in his movements, with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and the particular settled quality of a person who has been in enough difficult rooms to have stopped being intimidated by them. He spent an hour in the hidden room, reading carefully and methodically, making notes in a small leather notebook, and he came out looking the way serious people look when they have confirmed something they suspected and are deciding what to do with the confirmation. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at Ara. The documentation of the method is thorough and original, he said. It predates any comparable published work by at least a decade, which means there's a legitimate historical credit issue that goes beyond this county. The blue folder, he put his pen down, contains 3 letters signed by Harold Harrington that, if they are genuine, constitute clear evidence of deliberate defamation and fraud. We'll need an expert to authenticate them. But if they are genuine, Miss Whitmore, the Harrington family has a problem that a few $100s was never going to solve. What does this mean for the property? Ara asked. Your ownership is solid, Brooks said. The deed is legal. Harrington's complaint to the assessor's office is without merit, and my office has filed a response this morning that makes that clear. What this means beyond the property depends on how far you want to take it. How far can it go? He looked at her steadily. It can go as far as the truth will carry it, he said. In my experience, when the truth has been kept down for 100 years, it is very ready to travel. Sandra Page's article ran on a Thursday. It was titled, Buried 100 Years, How One Family Silenced a Scientist, and How an 18-year-old Found the Proof. It ran long, nearly 3,000 words, and it was written with the particular precision of a journalist who has understood that the most powerful way to tell a story like this is to stay close to the facts and let the facts do the work. That outrage would do less effectively. By 9 o'clock in the morning, May's phone had rung 6 times. By 11, 2 cars had come up the path, both of them people from the county she had never met, who said they had read the article and wanted to know if there was something they could do. The second person to come up the path that morning was Walt Briggs, Rosalie's husband, who had been a soil engineer before he retired. He spent 2 hours with the Red Ledger and came out of the hidden room, looking like Nathaniel Brooks had looked, like someone who has confirmed a suspicion and is reckoning with the size of it. This is real science, he said, sitting at the kitchen table. This is not a woman guessing at things. The soil analysis alone is more rigorous than most university work I saw in my career. This would have changed things here. This would have genuinely changed things. It still could, May said. Walt looked at her. Then he looked at Ara. Yes, he said slowly. I suppose it still could. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Calvin Harrington's lawyer called Nathaniel Brooks. Brooks was at the manor when the call came. He stepped outside to take it, and Ara watched him through the window. The way he stood, the way his hand didn't move to take notes, the way it usually did, the particular stillness of someone listening to something they expected and had prepared for. When he came back inside, he sat down. Harrington's counsel is requesting a meeting, he said. They want to discuss a comprehensive settlement. The word settlement moved through the kitchen like a change in air pressure. What does comprehensive mean? Ara asked. In this context, it means they want to offer you enough money to make this go away before it gets any louder, Brooks said, his voice neutral. The professional neutrality of a man who has seen this moment before and knew how many different directions it could go. They will offer you a significant sum. They will ask for the documents, the originals, and any copies, and a legal agreement that you will not speak publicly about the content of the hidden room or about the Harrington family's historical actions. They want to buy the silence that their grandfather already paid to create, May said. Essentially. Ara looked at Brooks. What happens if I don't take it? Then, we proceed with filing the formal legal complaint based on the documentation in the blue folder, he said. Authentication of the letters is already underway. If they confirm what I believe they'll confirm, we will have grounds for a case that is substantially more damaging to the Harrington family than a settlement number. It will also be longer. It will be harder, and Harrington will make every part of it as difficult as he is able to. He's already been doing that, Ara said. What he's done so far is preliminary, Brooks said without drama. As a fact, if we go to litigation, he will challenge the deed again more aggressively. He will try to find procedural irregularities. He will argue about the provenance of the documents. He has lawyers who are very skilled at making legitimate things look questionable. Ara was quiet for a moment. Does he have a case? She asked. Honestly. Brooks looked at her steadily. No, the deed is airtight. The documents are Evelyn Carter's. Your ownership of the property means your ownership of everything found within it. His legal position is weak, and he knows it, which is why he is trying to settle before it becomes public record. But weak is not the same as harmless. A weak case pursued by someone with significant resources can still cause significant damage. I want you to understand that clearly before you decide. Ara understood it clearly. She had understood it from the moment she saw the long dark car coming up the path. She had understood it every time she thought about the penciled note at the bottom of the letter. Don't trust him. From someone inside his own circle who was uncomfortable enough to risk putting it in writing. What would Evelyn Carter want? May asked quietly. Not to anyone in particular. Nobody answered right away. She already told us, Ara said finally. She wrote it down. Share it freely. All of it. That's not idealism. It's the completion of the work. Brooks nodded once. He picked up his pen. Then, I'll inform Harrington's counsel that you are declining the settlement offer and proceeding with the filing. He made the call from the kitchen table. Ara sat across from him and listened to him say, in the measured language of a man who has learned to carry authority in his tone without raising his volume, that his client was not interested in settlement discussions at this time, and that the formal complaint would be filed with the State Attorney General's office by end of business Friday. There was a pause on the other end of the call that lasted long enough to be meaningful. Then, the other voice said something. Brooks listened. His expression didn't change. He said he would relay that to his client and ended the call. He looked at Ara. They say that if you proceed, they will file a counterclaim alleging that the documents were removed from the property without authorization prior to your purchase, meaning they were never legally yours to begin with. Ara stared at him. No, Brooks said, it is not true. It is also not a coincidence that they are saying it 40 minutes after the article went live, because they know that a counterclaim, even a frivolous one, complicates the narrative and buys them time. This is what I told you they would do. This is the pressure campaign, Miss Whitmore. It starts now. She had known it was coming. Knowing didn't make it smaller when it arrived. She got up from the table and walked to the window and stood looking out at the property for a moment. At the garden she had been slowly clearing, at the outbuildings that were starting to look like themselves again, at the 37 acres of land that belonged to her and to Evelyn Carter's legacy in a way that no filing or counterclaim could actually touch. Let them file, she said. Let them say whatever they're going to say. We have the truth, and they have a story they've been maintaining for 100 years with other people's silence. She turned from the window. They don't have my silence. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the fastest of Ara's life. The counterclaim was filed. The anonymous hit piece ran in the local weekly, digging up her past, framing her homelessness as vagrancy, suggesting opportunism. Brooks had warned her. It was coming. She had already told Sandra everything, on her own terms 2 weeks before. The counter-narrative was already out there. He was 2 weeks late. She wrote a letter to the editor in response. She said she had been homeless, and she was not ashamed of it. She had been hungry, and she was not ashamed of it. She had purchased the property legally, with money she earned, and she had been working on it every day since. The people of Blackwood Hollow knew who she was, because she had been here working in plain sight for 6 weeks. She asked only one thing of the community: read the documents, all of them, and decide for yourselves what they say about who is and is not to be trusted. Something shifted in town after that. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. The hardware store owner looked her in the eye when she came in and said she'd written it well. Rosalie Briggs crossed the street one afternoon and said out loud that she'd been the one leaving the food bags behind the diner, and that she was sorry she hadn't said it sooner. People started showing up at the manor with tools, with food, with offers to help. Nobody made speeches. They just worked. And in the working, something happened that Ara had not known how to ask for, and would not have known how to create by herself. Something that felt like a door opening in a different direction. Not the hidden room door, not the courthouse door, but the ordinary door between one person and another. The door that requires both people to decide to walk through it. The public hearing was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks from when the petition had been filed. In the county meeting hall, the room was full. Ara sat at the long table at the front, with May and Brooks and Walt Briggs and Gerald Pitts, who had called a week earlier and said he wanted to be there, on the record, saying the transaction had been legal and proper, and that he would process it the same way again tomorrow. Calvin Harrington sat on the opposite side, slightly removed from his lawyers, with the posture of a man who has always occupied rooms on his own terms, and is not prepared to give that up. He looked at her once, when she came in, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away first. They just looked at each other until the moment was done, and then they both looked forward, toward the county board panel. Walt Briggs spoke first, clearly and without drama, the way an engineer speaks, with numbers and documentation. The board listened with the focused attention of people encountering facts that don't fit the shape of the world they thought they were living in. Gerald Pitts spoke next. His voice did not leave room for interpretation. Then, Dorothea Graves, 71, retired teacher, former tenant farmer, on Harrington land, spoke by video. She described 12 years of being told what she could and could not do on Harrington's tenant land. Practices she now recognized as Evelyn Carter's method. 2 of the 6 other women she'd brought with her spoke too. Similar accounts, similar years, similar prohibitions. The room got very quiet during those testimonies. The quality of the quiet was different from the quiet at the beginning of the hearing. It was heavier, the quiet of people revising something. Harrington's lawyer stood then. He was skilled. He raised procedural questions. He questioned authentication timelines. He suggested a coordinated campaign. He was doing exactly what Brooks had said he would do, and he was doing it well. Then Brooks stood. Brooks never raised his voice, but he was more prepared, more thorough, more capable of taking every procedural argument apart, with the specific patience of a man who had been in enough courtrooms to know that the truth, properly supported, does not need to be defended as much as it needs to be clearly seen. He addressed each point. He cited each document. He put Agnes Blackthorne's green ledger into the record, the one Ara had found at the bottom of the last box, the one that proved the coal deposit had been the real prize all along. That Evelyn Carter's research had been collateral damage in a 100-year land grab. He built the picture. And when the picture was complete, it was not a picture of a procedurally irregular deed transaction. It was a picture of 3 generations of a family that had decided a piece of land was theirs and had spent 100 years making sure no one else could hold it. The board took a recess. During the recess, Ara sat at the table and did not talk to anyone except Copper, who was technically not supposed to be there, but was there anyway, because May had brought him in under her coat, and nobody had objected once they saw him. He sat beside her chair and she put her hand on his head, and he was warm and steady and present, the way he always was. Then, Harrington crossed the room. Nobody had expected that. He came to the table and stood across from her and looked at her, and for the first time since she had told him to step off her steps, she saw something in his face that was not the performance of power, but the reality behind it, which was older and smaller and considerably more tired. "You found more than I thought was in there," he said. His voice was low, not quite private, but not meant for the room. "Agnes hid it well." "Yes," Ara said. He looked at his hands for a moment. "I knew there were journals," he said. "I knew Carter had written things down. I didn't know about Agnes's ledger. That's because Agnes didn't trust your family, even with the knowledge that she'd hidden something," Ara said. "She sealed it so thoroughly that even the rumors of what was in there were incomplete." He looked at her. The tiredness in his face was not sympathy, and it was not remorse. It was the specific exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining something enormous for a long time, and has begun to understand that he will not be able to maintain it much longer. "What do you want?" he asked, in practical terms. "What is it that you actually want out of this?" Ara looked at him steadily. "The deed confirmed," she said. "The research made public. The history of what your family did to Evelyn Carter acknowledged on the record. Publicly. I'm not asking for the money. I'm not asking for the land your family owns. I'm asking for the truth, to be the truth." Something moved in his face. "That's all." "That's not a small thing," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, he turned and walked back to his side of the room, and he said something to his lawyer, and his lawyer's expression did not change, but his pen stopped moving for a moment, which was the lawyer equivalent of the same thing. When the board came back from recess, the chairwoman, Patricia Kynene, looked out over both tables and cleared her throat. "The board has reviewed the record of the deed transaction and found it procedurally sound in all respects," she said. "The petition for emergency review is denied. Ownership of the Blackthorne Manor property and all contents thereof is confirmed as belonging to Ara Whitmore." There was a sound in the room, not a cheer. The room was too formal for cheering, but a sound, the exhalation of people who have been holding something tense and have been given permission to release it. "Furthermore," Patricia Kine continued, and her voice had changed slightly, become more deliberate, the voice of someone reading words they wrote carefully. "The board is formally referring the documentation submitted by Nathaniel Brooks to the State Attorney General's office and to the State Agriculture Regulatory Board for further review. The scope of what has been submitted is beyond the jurisdiction of this hearing, but the board wishes to state, for the record, that we find this documentation credible and significant." Harrington went still. "The board also wishes to state," she said, "that the work of Dr. Evelyn Carter, as documented in the materials submitted, represents a contribution to the agricultural history of this state that deserves formal recognition. The board will be writing to the State Historical Society to that effect." The room was absolutely quiet. Then, Walt Briggs in the back put his hands together once, and the rest of the room followed. It was not a long sound, but it was a real one, and it filled the county meeting hall, the way real sounds fill spaces, completely and without echo. Ara sat at the table with her hand on Copper's head and felt it land on her. The way truth lands when it has finally arrived somewhere it was always supposed to be. Brooks had been right. The hearing was the beginning, not the end. The Attorney General's investigation moved forward. Robert Keel, Harrington's property manager of 27 years, came forward. The man who had written the penciled note on the letter. He said he'd been telling himself for 27 years that it was his business, and he'd stopped being able to do it when he read Sandra's second article, the one about Ara's mother, and what she'd believed about people. He cooperated fully. His testimony moved the case from historical fraud into active, ongoing misconduct. Calvin Harrington folded, not publicly, not with an apology, but with his lawyers. He agreed to a structured resolution, public acknowledgement of what had been done to Evelyn Carter and to the tenant farmers, restitution to the families that had been harmed, permanent withdrawal of all property claims surrounding Blackthorne Manor, and he offered to fund the full restoration of the manor as community restitution under Ara's direction, for whatever purpose she specified. She specified a community agricultural center, free access to Evelyn Carter's methods, workshops, a seed library, whatever people needed. She named it the Carter Center. It belonged to her, she said. All of it belonged to her. The restoration began in January. Construction crews repaired what could be repaired and replaced what couldn't, true to the original structure. Ara supervised personally, spending part of every day on the property, making decisions, asking questions, learning things she hadn't known before. She was learning constantly. She had been learning constantly since the day she walked through the door, and she had come to understand that the learning was not separate from the living. It was the same thing. Dr. James Caldwell, the agricultural historian from Frankfurt, came down with a team. They published Evelyn Carter's research in a peer-reviewed journal, posthumously, under her name. The byline read Carter, E. Walt Briggs was listed for technical translation. Ara was listed in the acknowledgments. Evelyn Carter's final letter was quoted in full in the paper's introduction. The Carter Center opened on a Saturday in June, the first Saturday that was warm enough to have the doors open and the garden accessible. The ceremony was not large or formal. Ara had specifically asked that it not be. There was no ribbon cutting, no speeches from officials, no presentation that would have made it feel like something other than what it was. A house that had spent 100 years holding something in trust, finally releasing it to the people it had always been meant for. May spoke briefly. She talked about her grandmother, Cecily, about the promise she had made to her, about what it felt like to stand in a place where that promise could finally be honored. Her voice broke once in the middle, and she let it break and kept going, which was the most May thing she could possibly have done. Walt spoke about the red ledger, not abstractly, but practically, what the method meant in soil terms and yield terms, and what it was going to mean for families in the county who had been farming depleted land with insufficient information for their entire working lives. Gerald Pitts was there. He did not speak, but he stood in the front of the gathered crowd, with his hat in his hands, and he nodded throughout Walt's remarks, with the steady gravity of a man who is honoring something he was part of, whether he meant to be or not. Robert Keel was there. He stood at the back, and he was quiet throughout, and he left before the gathering broke up. But he came to Ara before he left and shook her hand, and said he was glad it was her. It was not exactly an apology, but it was something better, the acknowledgement of someone who has done the thing they should have done earlier and is not asking for credit for finally doing it. Dorothea Graves came in person. She looked at the manor, and she looked at the garden, and she looked at Ara, and she said she had told her grandmother's story to anyone who would listen for 40 years, and nobody knew what to do with it. Now it's in a legal filing and a peer-reviewed journal and a community center, she said. I want you to understand that what you did is not a small thing. I want you to understand that fully. I had a lot of help, Ara said. You did, Dorothea said. That's also not a small thing, knowing how to accept help when it comes. Some people never learned that one. Ara thought about the brown paper bags behind the diner. She thought about the first time May drove up the path faster than May usually drove. She thought about Brooks's two-handed handshake on the first day, and Sandra writing down her words and circling one line, and Walt reading the red ledger and coming out looking like a man whose grandfather had just been given something back. She thought about all the ways that help had come, not asked for, just offered, from people who had their own reasons for needing this to be true. No, she said, some people never do. The summer that followed the opening of the Carter Center was the summer Ara understood for the first time what it felt like to live somewhere instead of surviving it. She was still in the manor. She had a room on the second floor that she had finished herself over the winter, working evenings after the restoration crew had gone, making it exactly what she needed and nothing more. A bed, a desk, the cedar chest that had kept the blanket dry, a shelf for books, copper, slept at the foot of the bed, and in the morning they went down together to the kitchen, and she made coffee, and they went out into the garden, and the day began the way days begin, when you are inside your own life, instead of outside it, looking for a way in. People came to the Carter Center through the summer, farming families, some from Blackwood Hollow and some from the adjacent counties, who had read about Evelyn's method or heard about it from someone who had. Walt ran the technical sessions. Ara was there for most of it. Not as the director. She had deliberately not given herself that title, but as the person who was responsible for the place, which felt more accurate. She was learning what it meant to be responsible for something that belonged to more people than just herself. It was harder than she had expected, and better than she had expected, which she was finding was the truth about most things worth doing. In August, a letter arrived from the State Historical Society. It informed her that the society had voted to formally designate Blackthorne Manor as a site of historical significance in the state of Kentucky, citing both the architectural history of the structure, the significance of Evelyn Carter's documented work, and the events surrounding its rediscovery. The designation came with a small preservation grant that would help with ongoing maintenance costs. Ara read the letter twice and then put it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the hidden room. She went there, sometimes not to look at the documents. Most of those were in conservation now, cataloged and properly stored, but just to sit at the desk. The room had been included in the restoration, carefully, the walls cleaned and stabilized, the floor treated, the door rehung on its original hinges. It was still small and low and silencing and close, but the cold was gone now that the manor was properly insulated, and what was left, in the absence of the cold, was a quality of quiet that she had come to think of as the room's own character. She sat at Evelyn Carter's desk, and she thought about a woman who had pressed her pen hard into the paper so the words would go deeper, who had sealed a door and trusted that the sealing was not the end. She thought about what Evelyn had known sitting at this desk in 1923, and what she had not known, that the room would hold for a century, that the house would stand, that the truth she was protecting would outlast everyone who was trying to bury it. She had not known those things. She had done what she did without the comfort of knowing whether it would matter. And it had mattered. It had mattered enormously. It had mattered in ways that spread far past the borders of Blackwood Hollow. The published paper, the legal precedent, the families who were going to farm differently, because a woman in 1923 had documented her work carefully and hidden it from the people who wanted it erased. Ara put both hands flat on the desk. She said out loud to the room, to the quality of quiet that she thought of as the room's own, "I found it. It is free now. All of it." The room didn't answer. Rooms don't answer. But there was a quality to the silence that had changed. From the first time she stood in this doorway, with a lamp in her hand and copper at her heel and the cold pouring through the gap in the fireplace wall, the silence then had been the silence of something waiting, tightly coiled, held in against itself for a very long time. This silence was different. This was the silence of something released, something that had gone as far as it needed to go and could rest now. She sat there for a while, and then she got up and went back to the kitchen, where Copper was waiting, and the coffee was still warm. And through the window, she could see 2 cars coming up the path. Families coming for the Tuesday afternoon session. People with their own depleted soil, and their own generations of hard farming, and their own reasons for needing what Evelyn Carter had spent her life working out. She went to the door and opened it. She stood on the steps of Blackthorne Manor. Her manor, her 37 acres, her hidden room, her restored garden, her kitchen with its clean floor, her dog with his clear and patient eyes, and she watched the families come up the path, and she raised her hand in greeting, and they raised their hands back. 1 year ago, she had slept behind a diner with a broken zipper on her backpack, and the town had looked at her and seen nothing worth seeing. Now, she stood in a place that had been broken and buried and abandoned and written off, and she had made it into something that fed people, not just bodies, though it did that too, but the part of people that needs to believe that what was lost can be found, that what was hidden can come to light, that what was taken from you is not necessarily gone forever. She had not done it because she was remarkable. She had done it because she had shown up with $15 and nowhere else to go, and she had refused to look at what was in front of her and see only what was broken. She had looked at a cursed house and seen something waiting to be known. She had looked at a hidden room and seen a woman who deserved to be heard. She had looked at a town that laughed at her and seen people who were capable of better. And she had waited patiently and without bitterness for them to get there, and they had gotten there. Not all of them, and not all the way, and not without the slow and imperfect work of people, deciding one at a time to do the harder thing. But they had gotten there. Ara Whitmore was 19 years old now. Her birthday had passed quietly in May, marked by May's cooking and Rosalie's flowers and a card from Gerald Pitts that said simply "well done" in his precise county clerk handwriting. And she owned a manor and 37 acres and a community center and a dog and a community and a published legacy that bore another woman's name and her own fingerprints all over it. She had started with $15, and the willingness to see what everyone else had decided wasn't worth seeing. That was all it had taken. That, and the bone-deep refusal to believe that forgotten things are finished, because they are not finished. They are never finished. They are waiting in sealed rooms, in hidden ledgers, in the stubborn standing walls of houses everyone has given up on. They are waiting for the person patient enough and stubborn enough and present enough to open the door. Ara Whitmore had opened the door, and everything that had been waiting behind it had walked finally freely into the light. And it was never, not for a single moment, going back into the dark again.